My name is Maya Otarashvili. I'm the director of the Eurasia program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today for a report launch. The report is titled Russian and Chinese Interests and Influence in the Indo-Pacific. The report is available on our website, and we'll also share that in the message box on this webinar. This project is a part of FPRI's ongoing project funded by the Russia Strategic Initiative at the U.S. European Command. The report and this event are sponsored by the Russia Strategic Initiative at the U.S. European Command, and on behalf of FPRI, I would like to thank them for sponsoring our ongoing research. The views expressed in this publication and this event do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Defense or the United States government. With that said, I am joined by two of my colleagues here. Dr. Robert Hamilton is the author of this report, and he'll present his findings. And Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick will be the discussant. In the second half of this presentation, we'll use the Q&A feature to interact with the audience and share your questions and answer as many of them as possible. I would also like to remind you that recording of this event will be available on FPRI's YouTube page by tomorrow. So on YouTube, if you just look up FPRI, you will find all the recordings of our previous events there. Let me quickly introduce our speakers. Dr. Robert Hamilton is the head of research here at FPRI's Eurasia program. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel, and in a 30-year career at the U.S. Army, he has spent his time as primarily a foreign area officer in the Eurasia region. I want to alert all of you that Dr. Hamilton has a brand new book out with Springer Publishers. It's called The Russia-China Relationship, The Dance of the Dragon and the Bear. It's a really fabulous, thought-provoking book based on a whole lot of field research. I highly recommend this book. I will drop a link to the book in our discussion box as well. And we're also joined by Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick, who is an expert on Sino-Russian relations, Chinese foreign policy, and Arctic strategy. She's a senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University, also a senior research scientist in China studies at CNA. We're so honored and delighted that she could be a part of this project, and I really look forward to listening to this discussion. With that, let me hand it over to you, Bob, so you can present the findings of your report. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you, Liz, for joining us, and thanks to RSI for the opportunity to do this research. And Maya, as you mentioned, this is the first in a series of reports on Chinese-Russian relations in the Indo-Pacific region that we'll do for RSI. The next one examines China's use of the instruments of power or instruments of statecraft in the region. The third one in the series, which Liz is going to write for us, should be really interesting, examines China-Russia DPRK or China-Russia-North Korea relations, which, as everyone knows, if you're following those, are in a bit of a state of flux at the moment due to the Russian-North Korean cooperation in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The fourth report will look at Russian use of instruments of power in the Indo-Pacific, and then the fifth report will sort of be a summary that will examine their areas of convergence and divergence of interests in the region and try to take a little bit of a look into the future trajectory of the relationship. So that said, let me go into the findings of this report. I'll try to keep this to about 10 to 12 minutes, no more, and then I'll turn it over to Liz for her comments on the report or the subject of the report more generally. So China and Russia, their relations in the Indo-Pacific region really started to get on the U.S. radar in terms of military attention due to the increased pace of their joint military exercises and patrols, including some that have ventured out of the region as far away as Alaska and some that have operated close to the territorial waters of U.S. allies in the region, like Japan. So their joint exercises and patrols are on the rise, and the real inflection point was 2014, of course, Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, fomenting of war in eastern Ukraine, led to an uptick in Chinese-Russian military exercises and patrols. They averaged in the years before 2014 from 0 a year to no more than 4 a year. And last year, since then, they've been averaging in the high single to low double digits. Last year, they had 11, 2024, which was the most ever. We're also seeing more diplomatic and diplomatic and economic coordination, although I would argue there are natural breaks to their cooperation in those areas. We can get into those a little in the discussion. My sense is that as the Indo-Pacific bifurcates into what are really two mutually exclusive security blocs, one built around the US, its partners and allies, and the other built around China, this region is arguably where the forces of convergence between Russian and Chinese interests are the strongest, especially if you look at how they interact in places like Africa, where they really are just doing different things and each keeps to itself, or in Central Asia, where increasingly, especially in the economic realm, they're competitors. So let me go into what the report does is it breaks down Chinese and Russian interests, what I believe their interests are in the region, and then their influence, or how they go about protecting, using their influence in the region to advance or protect their interests there. So China, to start off with China. China believes it has vital interests at stake in the region, revolving around really two imperatives. What it sees as restoring its territorial integrity. We can get into definitions of how China sees that and why that sometimes brings it into conflict with not only its neighbors, but also external powers like the US. And then the second major Chinese interest is preserving freedom of action, or what we would label maybe a sphere of influence in the region. So these are important to vital interests for China in the Indo-Pacific. In the former category, territorial integrity, Taiwan stands alone. It's by far the most important. The Chinese do see, I think, this as a legitimate case of restoring the restoration of China's territorial integrity. The problem is Beijing also sometimes undermines its own argument here by claiming that its territorial claims in the East and South China Seas are also about territorial integrity, when in reality, in my sense, is that's really more about the second interest, which is establishing a sphere of influence or preserving its freedom of action outside of its borders in the region. So my sense is that Taiwan is truly a vital national security interest for China. The other claims, the other interests are important, but not vital. China's claims in the South China Sea bring it into conflict with Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam, all of whom also have claims in that region. Of the claims there, I would argue the Paracel Island claim, which Vietnam is a co-claimant to. The Paracels are the most important to Beijing. I'd be interested to see what Liz thinks on that. But in my research, that's really what kept coming out as a theme. When you look at the South China Sea claims, it's the Paracels and the claims against Vietnam that China sees as most important. And to support those claims, it's deployed pretty significant military force there. In the East China Sea, China claims the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. Japan administers those. My sense is that claim is probably more instrumental than emotional. In other words, it's as much about weakening or disrupting the US-Japan partnership or alliance than it is about China's actual desire to control the Senkakus, which again, Japan administers those. Russia, in terms of interest, Russia's an Asian power that has not historically acted as one. It's long coveted and gained territory in Asia, and in the early days, in the early centuries, late 17th through the 19th century, much of that territory was gained at China's expense. But despite the fact that Russia had long coveted and gained territory in Asia, it had historically looked to the West, both as a source of diplomatic legitimacy in terms of European politics, as a source of economic gain or economic growth in terms of trade, and also as a primary source of military threat. Russia has long perceived its primary military threat to come from the West, not necessarily the East. So most Russian turns to the East, and there have been several throughout its history, have come on the heels of an estrangement with the West. In other words, it's not necessarily that Russia understands implicitly the value of Asia and of its Asian presence, its Asian identity, and its Asian interests, it normally has turned east or turned to Asia when it feels rejected by or has a break with the West. This one was no different. You can see that the real Russian interest in reinvigoration of interest in Asia really started in 2014 after the seizure of Crimea and the imposition of Western sanctions, and it accelerated in 2022 after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So previous Russian turns have been China-centric. Russia is aware of this, hopes to avoid it this time. In fact, the 2023 Russian foreign policy concept, which is the latest one, says that Russia is a Eurasian and Euro-Pacific power, and it notes that 2/3 of Russia's territory lies in Asia. So at least this time, rhetorically, there is an attempt from the Kremlin to have a little more broader strategy in Asia than it has in its previous turns to the east. My sense is this is unlikely to be successful, especially economically. The war in Ukraine has really deepened Russia's dependence on China, especially economically, but also diplomatically and also in other ways in the region. Again, we can get into that in the Q&A a little bit if there's interest. So Russia needs to contend with two facts as it advances or defends its interest in the Indo-Pacific. One is the growing power disparity between it and China in the region, but more generally also. And the second fact is the fact that China just has higher order interests at stake in the Indo-Pacific than Russia does. So Moscow will be hypersensitive to being relegated to the role of China's junior partner in the region. I think what we're seeing, and we see this in other places where the power disparity is obvious and growing between them. China has been very careful not to say anything publicly that would imply that it believes or that it's aware of the power disparity between it and Russia, and to implying that Russia may be a junior partner. The Chinese are just, their diplomacy, their narrative has been a little more sophisticated than that. There's no reason for them to say that. It's sort of apparent. And it would just, as I said, Russia is hypersensitive to that label of junior partner. So Russia's regional interests are really contradictory. It needs China for its confrontation with the West. China is its only real partner in Russia's confrontation with the West, but it doesn't want to be dragged into Chinese disputes in the Indo-Pacific, of which there are many. On the other hand, it feels like it needs to support Chinese positions in many of these disputes because, as I said, it needs China for its confrontation with the West, but it also wants to maintain the good ties that it has historically had with Chinese adversaries, especially India and Vietnam. Couple examples here. Russia backs China's position in the South China Sea disputes with Vietnam, but sells arms to Hanoi and is also doing joint hydrocarbon exploration in the South China Sea inside the 9-dash line, or in other words, in territory that China claims as its own. Russia's stance toward the Korean Peninsula and the East China Sea have generally aligned with China's, but there's a chance that the emerging Russia-North Korea partnership could change that, at least on the Korean Peninsula, by making North Korea even less predictable and less reliable. And so, as I said, Liz is going to write a report on that in a couple of months, so stand by for that. Should be very interesting to see what her perspective is on that sort of triangular relationship in the region. Okay, final thing I'll get into is influence. What influence does each party have in the region, and how are they trying to advance it? Again, if interests convey what a state wants, influence informs how a state goes about getting it. Most states would prefer to use soft power or the power of attraction because this is less costly and often more lasting than coercion, especially military coercion. China's two big tools are the Belt and Road Initiative and the Confucius Institutes that it really has all over the world, but it has a lot of them in this part of the world. The problem is its aggressive pursuit of its territorial claims combined with its economic power and its demographic weight have sort of undermined its soft power efforts in many parts of the Indo-Pacific. And so it's got these two things that are sort of in tension. It's doing a lot of publics and a lot of elites in the Indo-Pacific do see the Belt and Road as advantageous, but they're also put off or even threatened by China's aggressive pursuit of its territorial claims. There was a survey last year across 10 Indo-Pacific countries, and 72% of respondents across those 10 countries said they were concerned about China's territorial disputes with its neighbors. The BRI potentially moderately offsets this, but really only in Southeast Asia or in the ASEAN countries. There was a survey there that found mostly positive assessments of the Belt and Road Initiative in ASEAN countries. and a majority in all eight Southeast Asian countries that were surveyed around the same time said China does contribute to peace and security. So it's a bit of a mixed bag for China in terms of its influence in the region. The interesting thing is the U.S., and I know we're not talking about the U.S. here, but the U.S. does seem to have, in some ways, more influence. There was, even within ASEAN, because outside of ASEAN, many of the countries of the region, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, are U.S. partners, and therefore Chinese influence is not nearly as strong. But even in ASEAN, there was a 2023 survey of ASEAN publics, and they were asked whether they would side with the U.S. or China if forced to choose, and 61% said the U.S. and only about 39% said China. So mixed bag in terms of Chinese influence, which has implications for how China would pursue its interests. Again, soft power tools are probably more preferable, but if the soft power tools are not working, then Beijing may feel like it needs to lean a little more on coercive means. Okay, and then for Russia, and then I'll stop. Russia would seem to be poised to gain an influence where Chinese skepticism is greatest, but it really hasn't for a couple of reasons. One, the countries most skeptical of China tend to be US partners and allies like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Australia. And the second thing is that the invasion of Ukraine has badly damaged Russia's reputation in the region. Again, that same poll in 2023 of ASEAN Public showed 83% of them expressed concern over the invasion. They named increased energy and food prices, followed by a violation of or erosion of trust in the rules-based order and a violation of national sovereignty as their chief concern. So Russia's actions, even far outside the region, have rippled into the region and had an impact on its influence, certainly with regional publics, probably with elites as well. And in terms of Russia had always been a big arms provider to the region. The performance of Russian weapons in Ukraine has damaged that, as well as the poor quality of Russian arms, the corruption involved in buying them, have caused several countries, among them Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, to have canceled Russian purchases since the war in Ukraine began. So to conclude here, I would say Russian and Chinese interests are fairly aligned over the East China Sea and Taiwan, often for different reasons, but Russia does tend to support China's positions on those issues. In the South China Sea, Russia rhetorically supports China's position, but again, cooperates military and economically with Vietnam in ways that undermine it. But to this point, Moscow and Beijing have been able to compartmentalize their differences on the issue, and it doesn't threaten at this point, at least, to disrupt the entire relationship. Russia's courting a North Korean assistance for its war in Ukraine, and suspicions about what it may give to North Korea in return can't be reassuring to Beijing. So again, that bears watching. And Russia's support for China's position in some cases has increased as its relationship with the West has eroded. So this implies there may be some sort of instrumentalism in Moscow's stance here. This may not be Russia really coming to endorse the Chinese position in terms of genuine endorsement, but just doing it because it needs to be aligned with China, because it needs China as a partner against the West. So let me stop it there and turn it over to Liz, and then we're happy to get into some Q&A after that. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to FPRI and to RSI for this opportunity. Bob has written an excellent report, and it's my pleasure to have the chance to discuss it here with you. One of the strengths of this report, one of the many strengths, is that it begins with a historical overview, and I think sometimes we leap right into the current situation without understanding the whole history of the two countries interacting in the Indo-Pacific. And they've been in a relationship of sorts since the 17th century. And so some of the reactions they have to different issues reflect this very long history of interaction, not just what happened last week. And this topic of history is one that some Russian scholars are paying more attention to lately because of growing nationalism in both countries. and how they reinterpret their history given this nationalist mindset that they have. And the fact that they don't always share a common understanding of the history. So even though they have settled their border conflict by agreements in 1991 and 2004, they still disagree about the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689, which gave China vast swaths of territory that is now part of Russia. And China similarly bristles at what they call the unequal treaties of the 19th century, where the current borders, more or less, between China and Russia were established. And also, if you look at history, Russia has been turning to the East, I would say, since the 17th century, sometimes with more attention than not. And this has not always been so Russia has been focused on the West, but sometimes it had to expand east to compete with Western countries for Pacific trade, for example. Also, there was a sense of manifest destiny that was especially strong in the 19th century when Russians tried to take back the territories they lost in that Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689. And also more recently, we have seen a discussion of Russia as a Eurasian power. So as Bob mentioned, 2/3 of the territory is in Asia. And since Peter the Great and the two-headed eagle, Russia has been trying to make sense of that, how to be Europeans based partially on the Asian continent. And so China, of course, has been a very integral part of this quest for Russia. And Bob rightly talks about their deepening partnership of late and the combination of perceived external pressure and internal pressure that drives them together. I would argue that this deepening occurred even prior to the first Russian war in Ukraine, I would say 2013 or so. And I think it reflects the influence of Xi Jinping, who has much more convergence of political interests with Putin in terms of their concern with regime security and political stability from outside interference. So Bob discussed the different interests that they have in the Indo-Pacific region, and I agree that there are factors that they see differently, and I would emphasize that these are significant because they might impact the extent to which Russia would support China in any particular conflict. So if you look at the South China Sea, the most recent statement in May of 2024 that Putin and Xi signed, Russia is very ambiguous about its position. It says that the Russian side supports the efforts of China and ASEAN countries to jointly defend peace and stability. So what does that mean? That does not mean that Putin supports the 9-dash line or anything like that. The farthest that Russia has gone is to say that it disagrees with The Hague standing to intervene in this conflict, and so that's not a lot of full-throated support. In terms of Northeast Asia, I think that Russia and China appear to have the same interests in the East China Sea. They do all kinds of joint exercises, as Bob describes, but I think the details are different. So Russia has a different islands issue with Japan, and although Japan now has been forcefully implementing the sanctions, for a long time, Japan was seen as an important potential investor in the Russian Far East and in the Arctic. And Japan still retains some investments there even now. And this is because Japan is concerned with China, benefiting from a complete Japanese withdrawal from Russia. So I think Japan is seen somewhat differently because of China's different history with Japan than Russia's. And on the Korean issue, I'll be talking about this in the future, but just to say, I don't think in the past they always had the same interest in the Korean Peninsula either, with Russia being more interested in denuclearization so that it could achieve some kind of regional economic integration with the Korean Peninsula in terms of gas pipelines, transportation connections that would benefit the Russian Far East. And China was willing to tolerate a little bit more low-level conflict if that was a distraction for the US that would reduce pressure on China. And China also liked to keep its integral position as the main interlocutor with the North Koreans. Moving over to the influence issue, I think this is a very interesting part of the paper where Bob outlines the different interests that the two countries have, but what does this mean for their relative influence? And I think this brings us to the issue of dependence and power disparity between Russia and China. So it's undeniable that China is much more powerful economically than Russia, and has longstanding economic and political levers in the Indo-Pacific region that Russia lacks. But I wonder if Russia's truly dependent in this. I think that there's a degree of interdependence that worries China. For example, Russia's new deepened partnership with North Korea kind of dragged China in by association to that partnership. And so there, China, even though it has a lot of leverage, has decided not to use it, and as a result is drawn into a situation where it loses its own influence over the Korean Peninsula at a time where it might have an opportunity to use it, given all the instability in South Korea at the moment. This could be an opportunity for China to engage with the South, but if it's perceived as abetting this military partnership between Russia and North Korea, that's probably less going to be viewed less favorably in South Korea. So I think it's interesting that even though there is this disparity, Russia has been able to go off in directions that are quite counterproductive for China. The war in Ukraine, for example, which has put a wrench into China's plans for the Belt and Road, for its plans for the Arctic, for engaging with Europe, and so on. But turning back to the Indo-Pacific, one curious question I have is, why is Russian influence so low in the Indo-Pacific? So 2/3 of its territory, longstanding interests in turning east, and yet we see, apart from energy contacts, and even there because of sanctions, these are trickier. We've seen declining arms sales since 2017 or so. Putin has not engaged very much with Asian institutions like the East Asian Summit. So it's curious that Russian influence is not commensurate with its geostrategic position there. And I've had the experience of talking about Russia as an Asian state in the Asian region and being looked at very skeptically by the audience. Russia is a European country. Why are we talking about Russia in Asia at all? So one thing I think that might be helping Russia is BRICS, because Russia, to emerge from its isolation, has been playing up the role of BRICS internationally. And it has had some success in the Indo-Pacific region, with Indonesia joining and Malaysia considering that as well. And so I wonder, Bob, what you think about BRICS as a way for Russia to enhance its influence in the region. And a country we didn't talk too much about is India. And I think, that India is a longstanding partner of Russia's country that China has a lot of issues with, especially territorial ones. And I wonder how Russia would react in the case of a China-India conflict, because we've seen some limited ones on border issues. I think, Bob, you rightly point out that so far the two countries, Russia and China, have been able to compartmentalize their differences, maybe less happily with Vietnam. There's some conflict between Chinese Coast Guard vessels and Russian vessels that are exploring in areas that China claimed, even though sometimes Russia moved its ships. So there's some limited conflicts there. Russia continues to sell weapons, as you pointed out. But India is a much bigger potential problem, and I wonder how you see that in the future. And I guess I wonder, given the fact that Russia and China do have parallel but not identical interests, whether we can really expect Russia to back China in a conflict. So especially in the South China Sea, I do wonder about that. Is Russia going, if it comes down to an overt war between China and one of the countries there, let's say Vietnam, would Russia actually back China in that situation, and if so, to what extent? And then Taiwan issue also is another one where I wonder about that. You mentioned it's been a source of differences between the two countries historically. They're still, even though Russia accepts what China calls the one China principle, they still talk about it somewhat differently. Like the recent agreement, May 2024, China says that Taiwan is an integral part of the People's Republic of China, which is a difference in the way that is usually stated. And Russia said Taiwan is a part of China, which is historical China, not the current state of China. And so it's interesting that they have different readouts of this very important principle. And I wonder if Russia wants to be on call for such an eventuality, and if so, how far it would go. If China has leverage in this partnership so far, at least in terms of the Korean Peninsula, we have not seen it used yet. So I'll stop there. It was a very interesting paper. I'm sure we'll get a lot of great questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And yeah, we do have some great questions already appearing in the Q&A, but I'll turn to some of the ones you raised, because they're also really interesting and important. So it's funny, in the paper, there's a very brief history of Chinese-Russian relations in the region, and you started off, Liz, by noting that the history of the relationship has not always been smooth, which reminded me of a conversation I had with a senior Chinese official posted here to the U.S. about, I don't know, a year and a half ago. And I told him I was writing this book on China-Russia relations, and I was looking at their interaction in different parts of the world. And he said, you got to be careful. Don't only look at today. Look at the history of the relationship. Keep in mind, it's a Chinese senior military official. He said, even at times in the relationship where we appeared to be aligned ideologically, we often were at odds. And so don't assume that an ideological alignment, which we did see through the Cold War, right? These were both sort of Marxist communist regimes and governments. But don't assume that an ideological alignment can sort of paper over more fundamental differences in interests. So I thought that was an interesting reminder coming from a Chinese official. And your question of why is Russian influence seemingly lower than it should be, given that China is seen as an economic and demographic, maybe threat is a strong word, but I mean China's economic and demographic weight, it's such a heavy weight that smaller regional countries are naturally a little bit standoffish toward China or skeptical of China. So why hasn't Russia benefited? I think there's been a few reasons. One, Russia's really leaned heavily on its historical partners in the region. You mentioned India, the Russia-India relationship, Vietnam, and without really trying hard to expand its reach or expand its influence to other countries in the region. The second is that, again, most Russian turns to the east have been really China-centric, and I think this one is no different. Most of the focus has still been on building the relationship with China, despite the rhetoric about Euro-Pacific, or Russia's a Pacific power and 2/3 of its territory lies in Asia. All true, but de facto Russian policy has long been either focused west or focused on China when it looks east. The other thing I think is probably regional publics and elites understand that Russia takes an instrumental attitude toward the region. It sees the region as only valuable for Russia can get out of the region. And so there's probably that awareness contributes a little bit to Russia's lack of influence. And the final thing, and I almost hesitate to mention this, but good old-fashioned Russian racism. I think we just have to call it what it is. Russia has long had a very, very racist attitude toward peoples to their south and their east. And it not only in policy, but in normal sort of rhetoric. And I think people in the region understand that. And so you've got this Eurocentric or Western-centric attitude in the Kremlin that also can translate into what I think you have to call just racist attitudes toward countries and peoples in Asia. So I think that also is a problem for Russia in building its influence there. In terms of the BRICS, yeah, I think so. With a couple of caveats. Can the BRICS be a vehicle for enhanced, Russian influence and enhanced Chinese-Russian cooperation? First of all, there's a difference in opinion between Russia and many of the other members of the BRICS as to what the organization's reason for being is. China and most of the other members would like to see it as an alternative to sort of the liberal international order or Western economic, diplomatic, and security structures, whereas Russia wants to turn it into an explicitly anti-Western bloc. And there's just not a lot of appetite elsewhere in the BRICS, especially the other founding members, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, for an explicitly anti-Western turn by the BRICS. And then the second thing is, as BRICS continues to expand, it will become, I think, less agile in its decision-making, and Russia's influence as one of the larger founding members will continue to decline, right, as the organization gets bigger. That's natural. The final question I heard you pose, would Russia back the PRC in a confrontation over its territorial claims? I think that depends on two things. What's the US do? And what's the status of the war in Ukraine? I say that because I think the greater the US role in some sort of Chinese confrontation with a regional country, the greater the likelihood that Russia will incline toward China or actually assist China in whatever ways it's able. The one way to get people in the Kremlin focused is to paint the enemy as the US, the West, or an agent of the US or the West. And so the greater the US role in any potential confrontation, I think the greater the Russian role would be on China's side. And then the next factor is the status of the war in Ukraine. If things in Ukraine are not going well and Russia really believes that it needs overt Chinese assistance, it may bargain its support for China in its confrontation with the West for overt Chinese support of it in its confrontation with the West in Ukraine. So that's what I would say. Let me throw it back to you, Liz, and see if you have any comments to that, and then we can get into the Q&A.
So why don't we open it up to the audience? I see a number of questions there. I can come in later if need be.
Okay, yeah, so let me just read the first one. After the setbacks suffered by Russia in the Black Sea, is it reasonable to expect the Russian Navy to effectively support China in any possible conflict in the Indo-Pacific? I don't know what your thoughts on that are, Liz.
Well, I think the questioner makes an excellent observation that Russia has been suffering in the Black Sea, despite the fact that Ukraine has very limited naval resources. So Russia has had to port its vessels in different areas and has faced losses. And it has an aging fleet, and does not really have the wherewithal to rebuild them. So I think there are plans for cooperation between Russia and China and some other countries as well to help reinvigorate the ports in the Russian Far East. But you know, as Bob said, it's not just a matter of the resources, but it's also how they, you know, how strained is Russia in terms of its commitments in Ukraine and perhaps elsewhere, and so I think they would see, but I don't know that Russia would overtly become involved. I think more hybrid actions are likely, some support on terms of cyber attacks or some of these underwater cable sabotage activities that we've seen in the Baltic. I think that I think Russia would certainly start with some areas where it had deniability if it would plan to support Chinese actions in the Pacific.
Yeah, that's a great point. That sort of hybrid. You don't. I think prior to what's been happening in the Baltic, we didn't really associate sort of hybrid acts with sort of naval forces or maritime forces, right? We associated them more with things that happen on the ground or in cyberspace or whatever. But we're seeing clearly in the Baltic that you know, you can wage war by other means, even with non combatant vessels, non-Navy vessels. So, I mean, I think my sense is Russia has the capability to assist China in the Pacific if it chooses to. Yes, so fair point and correct point that the Russian Black Sea Fleet has been badly damaged by Ukraine. Somewhere between 25 and 30% of the vessels have been badly damaged or destroyed, and it's been driven out of the Western Black Sea. It now operates in the Central and Eastern Black Sea, but can't really operate close to Ukraine. So, but that said, Russian naval activity elsewhere in the world has been at pretty unprecedented levels in the last 3 years since the war in Ukraine began. So it has not affected their ability or willingness to flex their naval muscles elsewhere. The Russian Pacific Fleet's got over 40 surface ships, over 20 submarines, so it could clearly do something. I think I agree with you, Liz, that it would be most likely in the form of not direct military intervention, but harassment of U.S. Assets or hybrid tactics, cutting of cables, sabotage maybe of oil and gas infrastructure, that type of thing, I think is more likely. So let me go to the next question. This one is coming straight to you, Liz, because it presages your next paper. How do you see the Russia-North Korea relationship influencing the dynamics between China, Japan, and South Korea?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it poses many challenges for China in its relationships in Northeast Asia. China has said remarkably little about the Russia-North Korea partnership. So we don't have a clear sense of you know, what the leaders are actually saying about this. But what we know, China's own relations with North Korea have been on the decline you know, of late. This might have to do with the Russia-North Korea partnership, or it might have to do with North Korea's provocative activities in the region. And so we have voices in South Korea talking about acquiring a nuclear capability. We had under the Biden administration greater trilateralism between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. Greater defense cooperation, you know, NATO interested in the region. So the security environment is not going in a favorable direction for China. And China is also kind of the observer in all of this, with Russia and North Korea taking the center stage in directions that are not clear. And so if we look at the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, by all accounts, China was not told the full picture of what was going to happen. And I wonder how much China actually knows about what's going on between Russia and North Korea. in terms of what Russia has promised North Korea in the future. So I think there are a lot of difficult questions for China that makes its diplomacy in Northeast Asia more challenging, and a time when it should have opportunities. With, as I mentioned earlier, with the political turmoil in Seoul and the the arrival of the second Trump administration, which might have an impact on U.S. alliances in the region. So China is probably not too pleased about this, but they're not saying a lot about their viewpoints at this moment.
All right, thanks. So the next question, it says, I mentioned how some Southeast Asian countries have canceled orders of Russian arms over performance or corruption. Question is, have they bought Chinese or US European arms instead? Russian arms can be appealing because of their lower costs, even if they're less effective. So the three countries I mentioned, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines. So very unlikely that Vietnam or the Philippines are going, well, very unlikely that Vietnam is, let me rephrase this. Vietnam is in an increasing and expanding military partnership with the US that has included US arms sales. I'm unaware if the Vietnamese have specifically replaced the orders they canceled with the Russians with US stuff. Philippines, same thing. Unlikely that they would buy from China, unlikely that Vietnam would buy from China instead, right? Because both of those countries have security competition with China in terms of their maritime territorial claims. So Indonesia and China have had a fairly long military relationship, so it's conceivable that Indonesia would then buy Chinese arms. But I'm not aware of exactly what they've replaced the Russian canceled orders with yet. And I'm not sure they've even announced it, those three countries. And yes, it's true that Russian weapons can be cheaper because they're lower cost and cheaper. Even if they're less effective, they can be attractive for countries. They also, by the way, show up quicker than US and European weapons tend to, and come with fewer strings in terms of corruption, transparency, democratic accountability, civilian control of the military, all those things that sort of come along as sort of requirements with US weapons. So you're correct to note that there is an attractiveness to Russian arms, even if their performance is pretty poor. Then the next question is, why wouldn't Russia try to fill the Chinese soft power vacuum by focusing on countries that are sympathetic to the push? The questioner said Chinese push, but I would also argue the Russians that use the same sort of narrative, the push against, quote, Western hegemony, unquote. Or even both countries have leveraged here and in Africa their lack of a past as colonizers of the region to sort of gain influence or gain legitimacy with regional publics and governments. I think so. Short answer is, I think the Russians are focusing on these countries that they think might be receptive to the anti-colonial or anti-Western narrative. Those are also the same countries that often tend to be more sympathetic to the Chinese. So it's a two-edged sword, right? I don't think there's an easy solution for Russia to increase its influence in the region at China's expense. And I don't know that they want to at China's expense. They would prefer to increase their influence at our expense, at US and Western expense. Okay, the next one. Does the relationship between China and Russia extend beyond a few foreign policy specialists, thinking about the language barrier and assuming the limited travel opportunities most people to visit in person? Liz, do you want to take a crack at that? I have a couple thoughts, but let me defer to you.
Yeah, in recent years, there's been a lot more interaction between China and Russia on all levels of government. So it's not just Xi and Putin meeting periodically. All different organizations within the government have committees, commissions, and so on. So there's really extensive interaction. And there's been an increase in tourism even before the 2022 war. I was in Vladivostok in 2018, and there were there was substantial Chinese tourism to that part of Russia, and Russians would go back and forth over the border to go to the dentist, to go shopping, and so on. So I do think that even though there is a language barrier, they manage there are Chinese stores that cater to Russians. They have Russian speakers, and similarly in Russia, you can find English can sometimes be a common language, or there's more interest in Chinese language. So I do think that there's more interaction than the question assumes. But also, I would say that there are different viewpoints in each country about the other one. And in China, the emphasis is on the partnership, but there are some experts and some in the business community who have issues with Russia, not just for the historical questions that we mentioned, but because of the difficulties of conducting business in Russia, the corruption, the changeability of regulations, and just a feeling that Russia's not the right partner for China because it limits its other actions. And on the Russian side, also there are people who feel that Russia's too beholden to China, that they're concerned about being a resource appendage. So there are different viewpoints, much less forthcoming nowadays because of the limited options for other partners. But these views still exist, and I think Russia does try to engage with other countries like India, Arab world, and so on, so that it's not only given the choice of Russia or China or isolation.
Okay. Yeah, I have nothing to add. It's a great answer to that question. The next one says, you noted Russia sells weapons to Chinese adversaries in the region. China has potential concerns about Russian technology transferred to the DPRK. Could these activities impact China's willingness to assist with sanctions evasion? My sense is, and then I'll turn it over to you, Liz. I'll be fast. My sense is the former not, because Russia's been selling weapons to Chinese adversaries for decades. The latter, depending upon how it develops, like what type of Russian tech transfer to the DPRK occurs, possibly, but and I would just say in terms of sanctions evasion, China's not really doing anything that many other countries aren't doing, and that is buying a lot of price capped oil and gas from Russia and selling a bunch of finished products, many of which are dual use, have military use as well, but are not they're not explicitly on a list of sanctioned items, or so China is sitting the fence or walking the same thin line that probably some large portion of the world, a third to a half of the world, is also doing. So, but let me turn it over to you, Liz, for that one.
Well, I think that's true about the oil and gas, but Chinese companies have been sanctioned by Treasury and by Commerce for their role in the dual use. And there's been some new allegations of Chinese firms producing drones for Russia. But in terms of what North Korea might do, China's been clear what its bottom line is, but also kind of vague about what that means. So they've said that the war should not be expanded. So I would say involving North Korean forces, it would be an expansion of the war, and that nuclear weapons should not be used, or weapons of mass destruction, and nuclear power plants should not be targeted. So we will have to see what kind of assistance Russia, as Bob said, what kind of assistance Russia might provide North Korea. If China is truly concerned about proliferation, would it use its leverage? Because over 90% of North Korea's trade is with China. So China certainly has economic tools, but they've been resistant to using them for fear of creating instability and a massive exodus of North Koreans into China. So they haven't used that leverage, and it's not clear that they're planning on using that leverage anytime soon unless something major would be happening.
Okay, we've got a few more questions here and a few more minutes. We can go over a minute or two if we need to get to the questions. The next one says, I believe the historical challenges to Russia PRC cooperation are oversubscribed to, especially in the near to midterm, especially with US Western pressure sanctions on both. Do you see this alignment continuing in the midterm? Of course, that's the million dollar question. What does it look like in 5 to 10 years? What's your sense, Liz? I know that's asking to predict the future, which is never
Well,
easy or fair.
it depends on what we mean by the midterm. I think that for historical factors to have an impact, you need to have certain domestic configurations, and you need to have a certain external environment. So I agree that the trend is towards a deepening partnership. But we need to look at how their domestic politics evolve, whether nationalism becomes much stronger in either country for any number of other reasons, and how that might impact this, or what their external threat environment is like. Does it
Mhm.
permit them to focus on these bilateral issues? Because China has really been able to become a maritime power because its border with Russia has been stable. And so as long as China is focusing on that and Russia is focused west, and then they're unlikely to resurrect these historical issues. But the point is that with Bob's excellent example from the Chinese military colleague was that you can't forget about these issues because it's not that they're over. They could return. We just don't know under what circumstances.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess I would say they're the two biggest drivers, I think, of Chinese-Russian collaboration or cooperation are one, the U.S., which has been called the binding agent in the relationship, which is why for this book project I just finished, I wanted to look at places where the U.S. footprint was lighter, like Central Asia and Africa, to see if you remove us from the equation, at least relative to how present we are in other regions, do they continue to cooperate or do they compete more? So there's the perception, I think, in both capitals that the U.S. threatens their internal stability and the external freedom of action, which drives them together. And then I think the personal relationship between Xi and Putin that has been, as you noted in a previous answer, Liz, institutionalized down the government several layers. So it's not just personal at this point, it's become more institutionalized. But I do think the Putin-Xi connection, the friendship, right? Putin, or Xi has called Putin his best bosom buddy. That friendship is a major component of the relationship, and I think it would change. It will change when one or both leave the scene. It's not really predictable how it would change because it has been, I think, insulated. There are some shock absorbers by institutional connections below Xi and Putin. The next one talks about basically their collaboration in information operations or disinformation propaganda. What about the Russian contribution to refine the Chinese disinformation playbook as it has been observed since the start of the war in Ukraine and their renewed collaboration? What's your sense there, Liz?
So we've seen, from my point of view, I've seen China echoing Russian disinformation points on Ukraine, and I think that's been a feature of this conflict that and it makes them appear to be more aligned on the issues than they might be in fact. And that's something to look for in the Indo-Pacific and other regions. To what extent do they cooperate, and if they do, how do they do that? Like by what mechanisms? Is it by cooperation between their media outlets? Is it through intelligence cooperation? How is it operationalized? I think that's something we need to pay more attention to.
There's three more. One of them's very easy. Is AUKUS functioning? Yes. Australia, UK, US is functioning. They hate it in Beijing. They hate it a little less maybe in Moscow, but yeah, it's still functioning. The next one, digital surveillance and cyber influence operations from China. Will it pressure US allies in the region? Will it continue, and will it pressure US allies in the region? I don't really, any sense on that one, Liz? I do not claim to be an expert in digital surveillance and cyber operations in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, it's not my area of expertise either, but I can say generally that that there is a concern that Chinese media can bring forward a narrative that does not have a lot of alternative viewpoints, and we need more efforts to provide alternatives and to put put forward competing narratives, finding ways to combat disinformation. And so, I mean, Taiwan has been pretty effective in that by with its NGO community that does a good job in trying to fact check China influence efforts. But there have been problems all over the region. Australia and New Zealand, for example, have been combating some difficult influence operations by China. And Anne-Marie Brady in New Zealand has written a lot about that issue.
Okay. Okay, and then I think this is a good one to end on. Circling back to the U.S. and the Trump administration, what have you heard from the Trump administration so far that you think can change the dynamics you've identified here, or is Indo-Pacific policy thus far a continuation of previous policies? So my sense is the Trump administration, so Indo-Pacific, as the Indo-Pacific as a region has not been among the Trump administration's initial policy priorities. It's been Ukraine, it's been the southern border and the deportations, it's been remaking the federal government, but in terms of, and it's also been sort of economic statecraft or economic warfare, as some people would call it, but the imposition of tariffs, including on China. And then China has now levied counter tariffs. So I think in the Indo-Pacific, the administration is, at least so far, leading with the economic instrument and leading with it in sort of a coercive method. So I think Indo-Pacific policy, at least de facto, is going to ripple out from what happens between the US and China in this sort of escalating trade confrontation. Liz, any thoughts?
I would agree there. I do think that so far the focus on government reform in the U.S. is likely to handicap some of our vast foreign policy tools, because the question about disinformation and about influence efforts. There was an office in the State Department that was combating these kinds of efforts that was closed. There are NGOs supported by AID that were involved in these kinds of efforts, and I think those tools really do provide alternatives to the Chinese presence in the region. And by using coercive economic policies, we're also following China's playbook, which other countries are not happy about. I mean, because they've been the victim of China's economic pressure. And if the US is also engaging in this kind of action, then it does little to set us apart. So I think that we need to rethink the kind of toolbox that we need for this competition with China, to make sure we have a range of tools at our disposal.
Yeah, that's a great point, I think, to end on. So, we talked about Russian and Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific and how has not been probably as good as it could be or as effective as it could be. The US was a bit of a bright spot in terms of our influence and our reputation were pretty strong. That stands maybe to be damaged by the fact that we're using coercive economic tools. In other words, this is the country that created and claims it stands up for the rules-based order, the liberal international order, and then also the fact that the USAID, the reduction or ending of USAID programs in the region, many of which many countries of which are developing countries still. It will certainly have an impact, a negative impact over the mid, probably to long term on U.S. influence in the region. So let's stop there. So again, as Maya said at the outset, the link to the report itself that we're talking about here, which is the first of 5 in a series for RSI, the link is in the chat. As well as the YouTube channel, the link to the YouTube channel. This will be up. This event will be on the YouTube channel soon. and then a link to FPRI's website if you want to see more of our work or support it. So thank you to everyone who made the time on a Friday late morning or early afternoon, or late afternoon, depending upon where you are, to talk about this. Liz, thank you so much for reading your report and providing such good feedback on it. And again, stay tuned. This is report 1 of 5. So we'll have 4 more reports and 4 more events like this over the next several months. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.